Hello, Joy Brooks with Email and Coffee. I enjoy learning about people, places, and things. We occupy this big, beautiful planet with as many variations on a theme as possible. And over our millennia, we have become more aware of each other, our similarities, and our differences. Our cultures come to depend on each other. This global community isn't something new because civilizations have been communicating with each other well into prehistory. I talked with Petros Koutoupis, a Linux systems developer with a passion for history as deep as mine. Our conversation focuses on the late Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 to 1,200 years before our common era. We talk about natural disasters, changes in warfare, and even piracy. I hope you enjoy this blast from the past. And now, Petros Koutoupis. Hello, everyone. Joy Brooks with Email and Coffee. I'm talking with Petros Koutoupis today. And, well, you know what? Let's let him tell us a little bit about himself.
Yes, hello. My name is Petros Koutoupis, and well, we're going to be talking about history today. But in my professional experience, history is not really where I come from. It's actually just a deep passion of mine. I'm actually in the technology field, believe it or not. I am a Linux device driver and kernel developer working on file systems for supercomputers. But I've always had a passion for history, and history is something that it's just something that I can talk on and on for hours. And as you can see from the books behind me, that there's a lot more. I mean, I'd show you all of them, but there's hundreds and hundreds. I just love reading. I just love absorbing information, and history is I just love history.
I have that same passion. I was bitten by the bug when my grandfather read me stories from little children Bibles, right? But he had this big book with lots of pictures of Egyptians telling the Moses story. And that did it for me. When I went to college, I didn't realize what I was doing, but I ended up taking a class. Oh gosh, it was some Greek class. I ended up with a degree in the classics. So I ended up learning Greek. I ended up learning Latin. I wanted to become an archaeologist, and I wanted to study at the American Academy in Athens. And words out of my mother's mouth, may she rest in peace. Now, she said, then over my dead body. I was a wild teenager of the 70s. So she was right. I don't know what would have happened to me, but I always read books. There I would be reading, like some wild, thick volume talking about the history of Catholicism, and people would be like, "Can't you read normal books?" But I would just love to read those types of books, a little dense. And
Same here.
Here. At one point, my husband said, "If you buy another book, I'll kill you." So I bought a Kindle.
I still need the physical copy.
I
It's
know.
I can't. I don't know. My wife does the Kindles, but she reads different kinds of books. It's just for these history books. I love the feeling, the smell. Everything about holding a physical copy. But it's funny that you mentioned that, because while I was in college, had I an opportunity to do it all over again, I probably would have gone into a historically focused discipline or field. But the thing is, especially with archaeology, I'm just going to quote or paraphrase what Eric Klein once said, Dr. Eric Klein, in a lecture. And he essentially talks about getting into the field of archaeology. And if you do decide to go into the field of archaeology, he says, well, prepare to continue living in your parents' basement, at least in the first, few years until you get up off your feet, eating microwave burritos, because that's just how it is for a lot of people new to the field. You don't really earn a lot of money. It's mostly experience. It's over the course of time. And as you build your credibility and build up your career, it's then that you start to make a name for yourself, and hopefully the money comes with it. But, at the time when I was deciding to go to college, I was with my wife, who was my girlfriend then, and for whatever reason, I just wanted to rush through and just be out on my own. And the thing is, I was good with technology. I was good with software development. And I ended up going in that field and finished a 4 years Bachelor of Science in 3 years just to get out of school.
I've got a few Audible books of Eric Klein, and he also has his lectures. So I walk every day lately, and I'm consuming his lectures. And in one recent lecture, he's talking about Athens, and he mentions Evelyn Smithson, and she was one of my teachers, one of my professors at Buffalo. I had completely forgotten her name, and he mentions her in light of the Athenian lady that there's an archaeological finding in Athens of the Athenian lady, and he talks about that. And I was rushed back to those days, and I wanted to go into archaeology, but I was not mentored. As I said, I was wild. It was 1973. My professors didn't recognize me for anything. And you had to be recognized to be mentored, to be brought into. So otherwise you had to work at it, and that's when I said to my folks, I wanted to go to the academy, and I wanted to continue because Smithson taught at the academy. And my mother was like, there's no way you go. And I was like, you know what? I'll get a job. I'll make money. I'll go myself. And it just never happened. Just never happened. I started a job in New York City. I continued Greek, reading Greek with a nighttime student from NYU. We read Greek together, and I did that for a really long time. And at some point I stopped doing that, and I had a normal life. Got married, and recently I'm just falling back into all of those old books. And so I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to start having those types of books read to me. I'm going to do Audible books because they're hard to read. Those types of books. I mean, I did it when I was a kid, but I can't do it now. So I started buying all those types of books and listening to them on the walks. And I fell. I also listened to YouTube, and that's how I discovered you. And I listened to a number of the different conversations and the lectures that you had, or the YouTubes that you have. And I've been doing that a lot. And it's, for me, I mean, I love it. I don't watch television anymore.
Yeah, I do. So what do I have on YouTube? I don't even know what I have on YouTube, because a lot of it was published by Classical Wisdom and Ancient Origins.
Right,
now, I do have my own Substack called Digging Up the Past, which is part of the Ancient Origins family as of a couple months ago. I mean, we've kind of brought things together. And that Substack, actually, I host a podcast of the same name, Digging Up the Past. And, I've talked with lots of historians, archaeologists, on the show, including Eric Klein and Chris Naunton and Stephanie Daly. She was wonderful. Who else? Amanda. uh, her last name escapes me right now. Podani. Amanda Podani. Yeah, and so many more that, it's being able to talk to individuals in that field. It's and talk shop in a way that I can't do in normal conversations. You feel like you're the weirdo, the outsider for, as you've mentioned, reading these books, these topics that nobody else can get into, a lot of it being dry. And then, I have the opportunity of my podcast. And right now you have your opportunity with your podcast and so forth to be able to do that. And I know that brings a lot of thrill, a lot of excitement, and something that I wouldn't have been able to do 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when the technology wasn't there. And at the same time, the internet wasn't there. Now, with the internet being where it is, getting in contact with a lot of these people has become so much easier with not just emails, but even on social media. I've been conversing with Eric Klein for well over a decade over, social media and by email, until finally one day it's like, I'll just invite him to the show. And we talked about his books and the end of the Bronze Age and so forth. I mean, it's a different time. It's a good time to be able to get back into things like this.
I think so too. I think I've often said that COVID was, it changed up a lot of things, but it wasn't as, it was pretty horrible, but it did a lot of good things as well. It just changed. It accelerated the direction things were already going, but it sort of forked it and navigated it in certain ways, forced it in certain ways, squeezed it in certain ways that I find. Well, maybe I'm exploiting them. I don't know. Maybe, I've had conversations with lots of people, and I talk about YouTube, and they're all in marketing. And I say to them very simply, you don't get YouTube. You don't get it, because they're trying to use it in a way, and maybe they'll find the way to do it, but it has a natural rhythm to itself, not just the monetization. That's difficult. I'm not talking about that. But how you can use YouTube, a lot of people are simply trying to use it like it's just a marketing tool, and it's a media tool, and it's really pretty fascinating. So along the lines of how we're speaking about things happening today and getting squeezed and forced, I want to talk to you about the late Bronze Age, because it's an era that I often find myself comparing to today, because a lot of things were happening in the late Bronze Age where we think, oh, suddenly it went dark. Everything stopped. And there were points in time where that's the history you were taught. It was barely dark, and an incredible amount of innovation came out of the shift from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And it didn't happen like, Monday it was the late Bronze Age, and suddenly everyone's using iron on Tuesday. It didn't happen like that. It happened slowly. So one of the first things we can talk about is that complex theory that has a rush of all of these different things that were happening. So, why don't you talk a little bit about famine, the biblical things, famine, plague, all these things that are going on.
So, in order to understand how the Bronze Age came to an end, one thing that needs to be understood is the state of the late Bronze Age just prior to it. We're talking about the 14th and 13th centuries BC, and it around the 12th, around 1200 BC is when we typically put, like a line in the chronological, ruler and say, this is when things change. This is when empires and nations collapsed or disappeared. But in order to understand how we got to that point, we need to understand what came before. And what came before was a very complex global economy that essentially encompassed, from our perspective, the Aegean world to the northwest, the Egypt to the southwest. In the center, we have the Hittites, the Levant, and then to the east of them, we have the Mesopotamian region, which is at that time the old Assyrian. I don't want to call it an empire, but dynasties. And further south to them were some of the remnants of the older Babylonian dynasties. So during this period, it was like I said, a connected world, not connected in the way that you and I stay connected today via email or telephone or whatever. It was a connected world, and it was all connected by trade routes, usually around, in the case of the European, Asian, African coastal sites, the Mediterranean. From the Mediterranean ports, they would travel by caravan or other means to reach nations further east. But it wasn't abnormal for something coming from the Minoan island of Crete, let's say from the Palace of Knossos on Crete, to end up in the court of Hammurabi all the way in Babylon. I mean, we have documented evidence of this, and Eric Klein speaks about it in jest quite a bit.
Pair of shoes.
About a pair of shoes that Hammurabi ended up doing a return to sender. And we don't understand why he returned it. Were they too small, or were they just not to his liking or something? But it was a connected world, and you had some big players in this connected world. At first, in the Aegean, it was the Minoans who essentially controlled the Aegean and the trade routes. They had a thalassocracy established. They controlled parts of the mainland of Greece, and a lot of the Aegean islands, some of which have been preserved under pumice and ash on the island of Thera, or Santorini to most people today, in a site we call Akrotiri. But they established like merchant towns and colonies along the Anatolian coast at the far edges of the Hittites and their empire. But at some point, the Mycenaeans took over. How that happened, how that transition happened, we're still trying to understand. Did the Theran eruption, weaken them to the point that it made it possible for the Mycenaeans to take over? They became the new power then. But, in the Anatolia, the Hittites ruled, as I mentioned. In the Levant, there were Canaanite cities and city-states, but the Levant was typically split in power between the Egyptians to the south and the Hittites to the north, because the Levant was seen as the crossroads of where everything came together, the center. And we continue to see this in writings, including biblical writings, for centuries and thousands of years later, where certain locations in the Levant were at the crossroads, such as Megiddo, Har Megiddo. It was a very important site that was occupied for thousands of years, going back to the New Kingdom Egypt, maybe even the Middle Kingdom Egypt. I guess I don't know the dating that well off the top of my head, but Har Megiddo will become the Greek Armageddon in later scripture and writing, because that's where everything came together. That's where all nations came together. It was considered the center of the world at one point. It held such an important place in the world of economy, and later religion. But it just It was a different world, and everyone was sitting on top of it all, like they were kings. The money was coming in to a lot of these nations if they were able to just extend their influence across their peoples, but then introduce their culture to others. So it was a good time. But what happened? Well, part of the challenge is we don't know what happened, and we're still trying to figure out. At some point, this came to an end. And in the early years of scholarship, when this did come to an end, we saw too many gaps in the historical record, including the loss of writing in some cultures, such as the Mycenaeans. They just completely disappeared. The Hittites, they completely disappeared, and writing was gone. And at some point, scholars were like, well, we don't know what's going on here, so it's just a dark age. And for a long time, we inappropriately kept labeling it a dark age, a dark age, a dark age, where it still persists today, even though since at least the 80s and 90s, archaeological discoveries have been redefining this period where it wasn't a dark age. We're starting to see a continuation of things, a continuation in life, a continuation of how things were, but under a new reality. People evolved, just like, and you brought up COVID. What happened when COVID hit? A lot of people thought that it was the end. This was, how are we going to recover from this? But we didn't have to recover because we just continued to be. We just evolved. Technology evolved. The way we handled things evolved to acclimate, to adjust to a new reality. And that's what happened then. So a lot of what happened then, we see a reflection of, or it's repeating itself in a new way across multiple generations, including ours, with most recently COVID.
Mm-hmm. It's I mean, they had we talk about today a climate change, and the term has changed so many times, but it's generally considered that it's generally accepted that climate changes and that it goes through cooling and warming for many different reasons, whether it's theory exploding, whether it was they say that there was a possibility that there was a heat at one point where the ice caps melted, that fresh water mixed with the salt water and caused a period of time where it was very dry. It did not rain because the salt water wasn't the right chemical composition for rain. So the Levant did not get the rain it normally gets, and we all know the Levant needs those rains, those regular annual rains, or they don't get grain. They, all of the foods that they, Egypt is the breadbasket. So if Egypt can't grow grain because it's too dry and it's too cool, too dry, it can't grow grain, that's going to tip off an economic disaster.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories as to why the Bronze Age came to the end that it eventually succumbed to, leading way to the Iron Age. Now, here's the thing. Some speculate drought in the historical record or in the geological record and the historical record. We do find evidence of drought. And yes, what happens with drought? A lot of people starve or find a new way to sustain themselves. There were natural disasters. We already talked about Thera, but that was around 1650 BC. Now we're talking about 1200. We do find evidence of earthquakes and potentially chain reaction of earthquakes across the entire Anatolian landscape and into the Aegean/Mediterranean Sea. What else do we see? We see a lot of things such as, and Robert Drews proposed this, a change in warfare that caused certain nations to be weakened to a new incoming rival or set of rivals, that we refer to as the Sea Peoples. But I'll get back to the Sea Peoples because there's a lot more to them. They are a lot more complex of a group of peoples than we give them credit for. And honestly, I think, folks such as Sanders or Klein to who have devoted their lives to shedding more light on who these people were, even though the evidence is just few and far in between. But anyway, so there's Drews with his theory on the change in warfare. So now chariot warfare becomes no more in favor of just a line of infantrymen who are able to be, quick and dirty and just get the job done. And when you have, mass groups of them, it's a lot easier to overwhelm the opposition. But then there's also an increase in piracy, which is one that I tend to lean towards, but not as an isolated and an only reason to the end of this period. And I'll get to the piracy in a second, but you have like a bunch of theories. And then you had Eric Klein in the early 2010s start to research this. And he said, well, what if it isn't just one thing? What if it's just a bunch of things that all came together, not necessarily all at once, but one led to the other, and some of them maybe simultaneously. I mean, you have to understand that there's no you don't get aid from other nations when something happens to you at this time of history. When something happens to you, such as an earthquake shows up and destroys your town or village or whatever, you're on your own. No one's going to be there to help you rebuild. You're not going to get financial resources from anyone else. And if there's an onslaught of, like a foreign nation coming to attack you, unless you have a very strong alliance or allegiance with, somebody else, the likelihood of you getting support or aid is also very minimal or small. So, Eric Klein said, well, what if all of this just happened within a small time frame? And then, climate change and so forth. This can play such a huge role or impact on this entire era and this global economy to the point where it can literally cause a collapse like what we see in the historical record, where now the Mycenaeans, they're no more. But what happened to the Mycenaeans? And I go back to, theories. One that I know that it has been pushed by what's this scholar's name? Louise Hitchcock, I believe is the name, where a lot of emphasis or a lot of their research is focused on piracy during the end of the late Bronze Age. And piracy has always stood out to me as one of the many key factors that contributed to this collapse. And that is what happens when people are depleted of local sources or foreign sources. They turn to a life where maybe they can get those sources by some other means. So if you start pirating off the coast of Anatolia, because you have to understand that a lot of these merchant ships that would travel from Egypt all the way to Greece, they'd hug the coastline.
Right.
They wouldn't go too deep into the Mediterranean.
Right.
And if there's pirates waiting for you, well, good luck. And a lot of time, these pirates would intercept a lot of these trades that are occurring, and then you have people in Greece not getting their resources or not getting the money that were intended for their exports or their resources. So now what happens? People are unhappy, internal rebellion, revolts. Now the elite that once made sure that everything was stable, they don't know how to quell this rebellion. So people take over, and that's why we're starting to see a lot of these internal revolts, burning down the palaces, which ended up, as we discussed offline prior to this recording, which ended up sort of doing us a favor, because during these revolts, during these fires and burning downs of these palace centers, they preserved the writings that we have today, the Linear B writings of the Mycenaean Greeks, because it was on clay, and that was intended for temporary use, and it didn't get a chance to get re-wet, or to get wet over again and rewritten over. Now we have a snapshot of what was going on at that point in time. I mean, there's just so much going on, and it's not just one thing. It's just many things. And because of just how the world was connected, you break off one piece of it, right? One piece of this multi-armed world, multi-connected world. The rest of it is going to feel the ripple effect. And that's sort of what we're seeing. They're going to adapt. Because when Greece disappears off the world stage, the rest of them adapted. It's just one by one, the rest started to fall off as well.
The palatial system really had to change because it couldn't quickly adapt.
No.
And one thing that I always do is, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and even the story of the Exodus. These are stories, myths, with kernels of truth. Like, I think to myself, okay, so we've got these major empires. We've got the Egyptians, we've got the Hittites, we've got the Mycenaeans, the Minoans. They're all great at different points in time. They're all trying to vie for something. They're essentially all they call each other brothers and fathers. At one point or another, they talk. They're always talking with each other, but they're always trying to get more. They want to be the chief, right? So they're squeezing people here and there. So while there's great times of peace, there's also fighting going on. So imagine a world where men can make the most of themselves as a warrior. So they essentially, they could be drafted into the army, but that's not how the system worked. These guys said, I'm going to be a man. I'm going to go off and show, that I'm a man. So the city would have this, expedition to, let's pretend, Troy, because they want to get that trade route. That trade route is from Asia over the Dardanelles into Europe. This is big. Aside from the fact that it also hugs the coast, it also went across the land. So, and it's quite large, because tin could quite possibly have been coming from as far away as the British Isles and Afghanistan. So we're talking, if you're using Europe, if you're using Asia going up the coast, and then you go into Europe, these people, the trade route could go all the way over to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and off to the British Isles. So Troy was at a very interesting point. Then it could have been a key to trade routes at some point. So we've got people at that point, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and they're thinking, if I go off to war, I can prove myself. All of those myths of the great heroes with their 12, they had to perform 12 feats to become great, to become immortal. Where did these stories come from?
Well, to quote Gregory Nage, or paraphrase, I shouldn't say quote because I don't have the exact quote in front of me. Myth is believed to have, a kernel of truth to it. Myth is, what is used. It's a vehicle. It's a tool that is used to organize, truth. But it's not necessarily, it's embellished on, right?
It's also not in order,
it's
you know.
no. And this is the funny part about what we know about the area of Troy from a historical perspective. Now, the thing is, yes, in the late Bronze Age, Troy sat at a very, very key strategic point on this in this economic world. It connected Europe essentially to Asia, and having control over this region was a big deal. They were a vassal kingdom to the Hittites. But according to Homer, there was a lot of, okay, even though it was Helen was the reason that 1,000 ships were launched, but if you look at it from a strategic point of view, Homer's telling of Troy, there was a strategic advantage to the Greeks, the Achaeans that Homer speaks of, to having control over this region. But the archaeology does not necessarily align with what Homer says. Now, you also have to pay attention to dating, and there are multiple dates to multiple destruction layers for Troy. The one that's most commonly accepted is about 1180 BC. I'm not giving an exact date, but around 1180 BC is the destruction, or around the destruction of layer 7A. This layer of destruction, there were found, burnt remains, arrowheads of Aegean style, everything that would make you think that this layer fell as a result of war. But this destruction layer actually postdates a lot of the palatial destruction layers on the mainland. So it's not like at the time Troy fell, Greece was in a good state, like the Mycenaean kingdoms were in a good state to be like, okay, well, let's organize an army and, make an expedition out there.
That's why I think of piracy. That's what,
So,
mercenaries. It's
so
more.
yes. So what happens when a lot of people, like let's say on mainland Greece and the surrounding Aegean islands, are not able to get the resources they need to survive? Well, they go elsewhere. I mean, it's sort of, again, a lot of the stuff that you see in the ancient world ends up mirroring the modern world, or across time, the multiple, eras. Like in the 70s, when my parents immigrated to the States, Greece was a poor country. They could not, there was no future for them there. And they knew that, they recognized that. So in their very late teens, they were kids. In their very late teens, they immigrated to the United States and started a life here because, one, the American dream, and two, because there was more of an opportunity for them here than there was back at home in Greece. And it was the same during this time, which prompted these mass migrations, not just people in the Aegean world, but people even in Anatolia. They were migrating to find a better way of life, which is why in the Egyptian carvings of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, you don't just see people's fighting on the Delta coast with the Egyptians. You see sea peoples on their boats with their families, with their livestock. With this, they actually picked up their entire lives to find a new way of life, which is they're just finding a new home, finding a way to survive. So, we kind of misinterpreted the sea peoples over time because of the biased Egyptian writings and what the little that we knew from the early 20th century archaeology, or late 19th, early 20th century archaeology. But now we have a better understanding of what was going on. And as these Aegean migrants were heading east and south, in some cases, they left a wave of destruction, and Troy could have been a victim to this. Hence the reason why we see Aegean things, like arrowheads and stuff in layer 7A. But were they Greeks? Were they Mycenaean Greeks? We don't know. We don't have a way to directly connect the Mycenaeans with this level of destruction. We just see a connection with the Aegeans, but that could be anybody, that could be anything. And so what happened during and around this time, over a span of 150 years or so, 200 years, maybe closer to 150, is we find through the Hittite records. Again, this is thanks to the destruction of Hattusa, which is the capital of the Hittite Empire, that these clay tablets were burnt and cooked where the writing was preserved. And because of that, we're able to see what was going on during this time. And the Hittites speak of a group of peoples called the Akiawa. And they were led by, a ruler, like a king of Akiawa. And they were causing a bunch of commotion and ruckus along the Anatolian coast prior to this, when the palatial centers were still around in mainland Greece. And, we see all these activities, these little skirmishes and micro battles and so forth. But we see a lot of conflict, and some of it is directly and indirectly connected with Troy, or as the Hittite text refers to as Vilos, or Vilusa. I'm sorry, Vilusa.
Melusa.
And Vilusa
Helios.
was
With
the
the
name
Helios.
Helios. Yes, so it's Troy. And we find, this is the best part. This is the best part. And this goes to show you how oral tradition works with Homer. We find names. We find Alexandru, which is, Alexander is the name of Paris, another name. We find a rendering of the name Priam. We find a rendering of the name Atreus, Ataraisa. We find so many names that Homer shares with us in his telling of this, epic tale, or at least, the last, remaining moments of this epic tale in the Iliad. We find these cast of characters in the historical record, but we shouldn't confuse them with Homer's cast of characters. They're just names.
Right.
We just find these names. So the dots are being connected. And we see, like I said, multiple little events, but going back to Gregory Nage's paraphrase I shared earlier, it was the role of a bard, such as Homer, that was able to bring all these multiple events together and then paint a single picture, create a cohesive narrative that eventually came down to us, probably through many revisions, many rewrites, depending on the audience he was trying to entertain. Because remember, the role of the bard is to entertain, so there's going to be some artistic liberties taken and so forth. And we have the version of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then later on the entire Trojan cycle that we have today. But it's all based on these little tiny events that
these little kernels of truth.
Exactly.
Like the Odyssey, when it talks about Odysseus and his journey back that took 10 years, and he goes back home and his home is a wreck, and all these suitors are trying to get to Penelope, and I mean, that's talking about piracy.
Yeah, pretty much. You see a lot. And here's the problem: not having context, you tend to overlook these details. And the same thing goes for the Bible, right? If you don't have the historical context of what was going on at that point in time in history, and we're talking about, the Bronze Age, for example, and how oral tradition works and how these stories came together, you tend to lose, these little details you just tend to overlook. And yes, there's a lot of references which could be considered, piracy or piratic type activities that, now with understanding this context, you pay attention to, you see for what it is.
Right. Polyphemus, and they're running off with the sheep, the pigs, whatever.
The sheep, yes.
The sheep. Polyphemus is a giant. Well, guess who else talked about giants? Just interesting stories. one thing, you mentioned the Bible, and I wanted to pull in the Exodus, because the Exodus is around about the same time. And Ramses the Third talks something about it, or mentions something about it. The Merneptah stele mentions the Israelis. I mean, we have very little history.
Yes, that's an interesting time, and the Exodus is a very interesting topic that, you know, part of the challenge is we can't prove the Exodus of the Bible. Just like we can't to this date. We've discovered Troy. We've discovered events that would have inspired the Trojan War, but we can't prove Homer's Troy. Just like the biblical Exodus, we can't prove exactly what the Bible, the book of Exodus specifically states. And here's the thing: during that time, and again, context is key. During that time, when these mass migrations were occurring, at some point, and you mentioned Ramses the Third, not Ramses the Second, which Ramses the Great people are more familiar with, but Ramses the Third, who came after him. Both him and one of his, predecessors, Merneptah, who you've mentioned again, were fighting these waves of sea peoples that were coming in from the Delta region, trying to find, again, a new way of life. And in the case of Ramses, part of the challenge for him was, what am I going to do with these people? So he ends up relocating a lot of them to the east, the Philistines included. He mentions the Peliset, which are the Pelishtu. No, yes, the Peliset, who he ends up, relocating along the Levantine coast. And because, the Philistines, they came from the Aegean world. And it wouldn't be later like DNA analysis that were able to confirm this. Before that, it was just speculation. But in more recent years, in the last decade, we were able to confirm that they came from the Aegean. He settled them along the Levantine coast, and they established their own, colonies, the Pentapolis, the 5 cities that we've come to know about in the Bible, which we found all but one. And these peoples, these Philistines, lent a great influence, good or bad, to the Hebrew writings and specifically the Old Testament writings. But yes, there was a lot going on. And again, this is where context is key, and understanding biblical authorship as well. Now, there's many schools of thought on how the Bible came to be. You have, the more, the traditional route, which is, Mosaic authorship. Moses authored the first 5 books of the Torah, or what we refer to as the Pentateuch, with the exception of his own death. That was, penned by someone else, but everything else was Moses. But starting, the past couple of centuries, we've been questioning that, and a lot of theories have come forth. You have the source hypothesis, or the documentary hypothesis, that describes multiple authors over multiple moments in time, some of which were motivated for one reason or another to write their parts of the Bible, and then at some point, likely during the exilic or post-exilic period, this came together into a single form, to the form that we know today as the Pentateuch. Now, there's also, and other theories such as the what do they call it? The Persian, like imperial hypothesis. The name escapes me right now, where it talks about how the books were written during the Persian period, after the exilic period, when the Jews came back from their exile from Babylon. But again, either way, context is key. And the thing is, I tend to subscribe to the documentary hypothesis because in my head, it just seems to make more sense, especially when you break down the authors and study a lot of these key events, which include the Exodus. For instance, the 5 labels that we refer to these authors are the Elohist, the Yahwist, the priestly, the Deuteronomist, and what's the other one? Elohist, Yahwist, priestly, Deuteronomist, and there's the fifth. You know what? It escapes me right now, but that's okay. The point is, if you pay attention, it is one of the authors, I think it may be the Elohist, who actually describes in the fragment of Exodus attributed to this author how multiple people, multiple groups of people came together for this Exodus. So the Bible itself says that it wasn't just the Israelites, it was many groups of people that came together. And that sort of sheds a light on what we're seeing during the time of Ramses, how there's multiple groups of people that are in the Delta region and they're getting displaced. Now, were the Israelites one of them? I don't know, because according to
were the Israelites sea peoples, because they came from their ships and with their carts and oxen and family. So were they just
there are theories.
Caravan?
There are theories that one or two or more tribes, because there's 12 tribes of 12 children of Israel,
right?
And that means 12 tribes. So there are theories out there which haven't been proven that some of these groups of sea peoples could be tied to one or more of these tribes. But the only thing they're using is name, with the exception of the Danites.
I was going to say the Danites.
Who there are a few verses in the Old Testament here and there, such as in the Book of Judges, that showcase how the Danites, or the tribe of Dan, had some knowledge in seafaring. Right. Well,
they were at the. I'm trying to figure out. There was some expedition where they shored up the end of the expedition. I can't remember what it was, but they mentioned the Danites as being the last of the. Maybe it was the Exodus. No, it wasn't. I can't remember what it was. I'll have to look that up. But there's also the Philistines and the Canaanites, and there's this big hole in between, and that's Dan.
Their placement is a very interesting, unique placement, because it exposed them directly to the Philistines specifically, which is why you have the story of Samson.
Right.
He's from the tribe of Dan, and he's hanging out with Delilah and having a good time. But why is that? Well, it's because these nations, it wasn't as black and white as the Bible portrays it. Right. They had to survive, and in order for you to survive, you had to work with your neighbor, whether you're trading goods back and forth. The thing is, the Philistines already had resources. They knew how to work with metals. They knew how to develop, certain arts, crafts, things like that. And it made commercial sense. It made sense for the Israelites, or the tribes further north, to be working with them, because they needed those resources they didn't have, especially if they just showed up. I mean, they're from a nomadic groups of people, and now you're starting to transition from being a nomad to learning how to cultivate the land, especially a land that you're not familiar with. Well, you're going to need all the help that you can get.
It's sort of like, as I mentioned before, the Levant is getting squeezed, and whenever you squeeze, you get heat, and all of these things are getting they're heating up. The religions are getting squeezed together. You've got Hittites, you've got Zoroastrianism, you've got let's not talk about Zoroastrianism. I'm fascinated with El and Yahweh, and how they end up the religion of the Hebrews. And I don't remember exactly who said it, but the reference of Elohim in the Bible That's a plural version.
Okay. So this is a tricky topic. So a little bit of backstory about me, and I'll get to that. Um, what what a lot of people don't know about me is that I'm autistic, and because I'm autistic, I tend to hyper focus on a lot of details that I am interested about, and for most people, it's irrelevant details. So because of this ability to hyper focus on my passions, I spent a considerable amount of my time uh, teaching myself biblical Hebrew. So not just biblical Hebrew, but even a lot of the dead Semitic languages, such as Ugarit, Akkadian, and so forth. Phoenician to some extent. So I was able to understand at a base level of these languages and what they said and how they could be interpreted and so forth. Now, with regards to what you're saying about Elohim, yes, technically Elohim is a plural word, but just because in structure it's a plural word does not mean that it has, when it's used, that it has to be plural. It's just the fact is it's the way it's being used and said, which essentially just symbolizes, the greatness of the God. So yes, if you take the literal translation, it'll say, you know, um, gods, and a lot of people use that as evidence. And I put this in quotes, as evidence of, a polytheistic religion. I'm not saying that early Israelite religion was not polytheistic, and I'll get to that. But and a lot of times, a key verse from the book of Genesis 6:4, is typically used to support this, and that is, the Ben Elohim, the sons of God. A lot of folks interpret this as, the sons of the gods. What is this talking about? Well, yes. While I will while I will state that in this context, in this reading of the verse and the many other verses that reference Elohim, I believe that it's Elohim as in, the great God of gods, as opposed to,
I think so too.
Concept.
It's a different concept.
Well, what you see is, yes, and the problem is I'm not understanding.
The beginning of monotheism, it's how you can actually see it getting squeezed, because if you've got a pantheon of gods and all these horrible things keep happening, right? You have to start distilling down. Why isn't the storm god helping me? It's raining on me. Why isn't the sea god helping me? I drowned at sea. Why, all of these things, why don't they help me? And you begin to think about God differently. In other words, he's not there to be at your whim. He's not your tool. And you might begin to squeeze them all together, because you know what? Maybe it's just this one big greatness that I don't understand.
You start to see a trend in the Iron Age. And the trend is that a lot of these nations, and it's not just Israel, but a lot of these nations start to develop this idea as a god of the peoples. The Assyrians had Ashur. The Babylonians had Marduk. The Urartians to the north of Syria had their own, and there was just a god of the peoples. Now, the problem is, even though a god of the peoples was starting to be identified and established in the land of Israel, it was still predominantly a Canaanite background. There were Canaanite influences everywhere, Canaanite gods everywhere. So the other gods were still acknowledged, and a lot of the more urban areas had cult gods of the family. That's where you see a lot more worship of Asherah, which we've identified in the early years as potentially the wife to the Hebrew god, that eventually fell out of favor over time, to take a more true monotheistic approach. But up until the exilic period, we still see evidence of multiple gods being worshipped. Whether it was frowned upon or not, the archaeology still shows that there were cult worshipping of other gods. I mean, that's the part of the reason of why we constantly read of the Baals and the Astartes, the being cast down by Yahweh, don't worship your false gods and so forth. But what happens when the Babylonians finally took over Jerusalem in 586 BC or whatever year it was, and then he exiled a small part of the population eastward to Babylon? The people start to look at it differently, and they start to look at it as, our gods did not fail us. It's not that our God. It's not our gods are punishing us. It's our God is punishing us. So it was easier for them to just identify a single entity that was looking over them, and then because they didn't do their due diligence to appease this deity, this foreign nation finally took over, and then now their people are scattered across the Babylonian Empire. So you see this transition in the archaeological record, and then even in the scriptural record, if you subscribe to, like I said, some of the other theories like the documentary hypothesis and the style of writing, from the other authors, that you start to see this transition from what I will consider a more henotheistic approach, where you have this one ruling deity, and then just a bunch of other deities in the background, and then to a true monotheistic religion by the exilic period. So you see this evolution, and it's very interesting. But it's one thing that a lot of people don't know about this. In Israel, and then even in Egypt, because there was a strong Jewish community in Egypt, there were different versions of Yahweh.
Right.
There was a Yahweh of this location, a Yahweh of that location. And it wasn't until all the other locations fell to Assyria and later Babylonia that it just became the one Yahweh with the temple in Jerusalem. So,
which is why all of the literature began to get formed the way it was, because they had to go ahead and prove it in hindsight, retrospect.
Well, I will let you in on something that not many people know about. And this, again, because of my autism and being able to read some of the driest materials that could be torture to some people. And that is George Smith, the same George Smith that translated the 11th tablet and all the other tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, who was the first Assyriologist to find a literary record of the flood, the Great Flood, but in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He at some point translated the annals of Ashurnasirpal II. Ashurnasirpal II, at around 930-ish BC, was redefining the borders of the Assyrian Empire. So he traveled all the way west to the Mediterranean coast. And in doing so, we have a written record of his expeditions west. And in this record, we find a reference to a deity. Now, this deity, it's hard to say whether it was a deity, and I'll get to how the Assyrians adopted other nations' gods. Or I'm just gonna say now, the Assyrians had a habit of adopting other nations' gods, especially other nations' gods that they've taken over in their conquests of other areas. Now, we don't know if this deity is one that came out of Assyria or one that they just kind of brought into their, pantheon of deities. But they reference multiple times a flood god called Yav. Or Yah. No, I'm sorry, Yah. So Yah, not Yahweh, but Yah, the flood god. And multiple times in the annals of Ashurnasirpal II. Now, I'll be honest with you. These are in the writings of George Smith. I have not seen any scholar afterward ever draw any connections with Yahweh like I have. But there's also a reference to a Yav who's seen as a storm slash flood god in the writings of the Ugarites.
I was going to say Yam is
Yam is a sea god, but I'm talking about Yav.
Yeah.
Yav was like another title to Baal Hadad, which was the storm god of the Ugarites.
Well,
so you see like this
fighting, to fighting the chaos of the sea and bringing it all into order.
Correct. So it's funny that you see like this potential reference. So the god Yahweh, may have been discovered in Israel, may have come from somewhere else, but it's funny how over the course of time you start to see connect the dots and start to pull these pieces together. Then you see things a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. I don't think monotheism would have bubbled to the top had not the late Bronze Age forced it to happen. I don't think it would have happened. We went from this nature hugging concept of God, the relationship that they had, to every little thing. There was a God for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way that's the way they thought. Whether or not that's really how they thought, but that's how they understood. It was poetic. I mean, it's okay. It's okay to be poetic. We consider ourselves to be romantic. We watch movies, right? We have Marvel series and all of this. They did the same thing. That doesn't mean that they believed it wholeheartedly. There may have been people that did believe it. I mean, you will have people that just love Spider-Man to death, but that doesn't mean everybody believes in Spider-Man. They're heroes. So
I believe in Spider-Man. What are you talking about?
So okay. So
I'm kidding.
So you've got all of these concepts and the birth. I don't know what we'll call it. The birth of philosophy. The birth of, let's think about this in relationship to humanity. Let's try to make sense out of it. Let's develop, without even knowing that they were developing something new. Let's develop something new, because along with Hammurabi and the code, I mean, yes, well, I can't remember what it is. I don't remember exactly the Egyptian dynasty that had these codified laws that if you read through them, I'm like, this is like the Ten Commandments, but it's a much longer version.
Yeah, we find various versions across multiple nations here and there, and the version of the Hammurabi stela that we see today. I mean, there were multiple that were erected across multiple sites, so it wasn't like the only one discovered as well. But yeah, we find the same code in the Bible. Thou shalt not kill. Eye for an eye, and so forth. So it wasn't. None of that stuff was unique. It was just being a good person, right? What you should do, what you should not do.
The definition of a good person. Talk about identity crises. They were just trying to figure out, who am I? What am I? How do I relate to this whole thing? Where do I come from? What is this all about? What's the point in all of this? Should I just like walk into the desert and, drop dead somewhere? Who cares? Who cares? And even though today we think we're so advanced and so different, we're going through the same things they went through.
No, it's amazing that every now and then, when I go to a museum with my wife and the kids, they'll see a lot of things behind the glass, and sometimes it'll catch them by surprise. Like, wait, what? They had these things back then? It's like, yeah, we haven't changed. Now, here's the thing. Technologically speaking, sure, of course, since the beginning of humankind, we would invent things and then build on top of those inventions and build on top of that and build on. So it's we're never starting from scratch, and that's why we are where we are today through just the innovation of our predecessors and building on top of it. But the thing is, what makes us human, the simple things in life, the things that we value, and so forth, it's all been the same. Nothing has changed. It's all been the same. So it's just amazing to see and know that, because when you do know that, you tend to appreciate the way things are and have been, more so than somebody who just thinks like, oh, they were idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. That's why, we live in an era that is far surpasses them. Oh yeah, technologically, sure, we can build skyscrapers. We can fly planes across the Atlantic.
They built skyscrapers.
Well, I mean, they're
Or
yes,
they built skyscrapers.
pyramids,
Pyramids, yes.
ziggurats, obelisks. Yes, they had their own version, but I mean, we have real skyscrapers here.
Yes. But, I think it's a good, I think history, when people who say they don't like history, okay. But if you really do begin to at least read history, appreciate it for what it is, and don't try to put labels on it. Oh, they were bad people. Oh, the Romans, those are bad people. I mean, oh, the Nazis. Oh, no, those were really bad. You really need to put it all into perspective, and you could see where they came from, why they were there, what they were doing, what caused them to, do what they did. The Romans were great until they killed Jesus, right? And then they became the bad guys, right? The Germans were okay until World War I, and then they didn't become such good guys after all. And then guess what happened? World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, all of these things we tend to uproot and take out of the historical record, and you can't do that.
Again, as I mentioned, context is key.
Context.
If you don't have the context, then you tend to overlook things or not understand things. And honestly, the problem is, well, many of us grew up, maybe in history class or even on television, watching a lot of those older documentaries. And the thing is, the way history was delivered to us was always in a dry, boring manner. It's just a matter of how can we make it exciting? Because it is exciting.
Right.
There's just so much going on. All the, the scandals, the war, the sex, the this, the that, everything that people watch in their TV shows today literally happened over the course of history. It's just because it's not on the TV and played out for them in this dramatic, exciting manner, they don't appreciate it or care to spend any time to learn about it. And sure, history is not for everyone, but it's just a matter of how you deliver the topic, how you present it, and it can make or break how a person feels about these topics.
It's certainly, I sleep more easily because of it. I remind myself, we've been here before, and somebody's felt the way I felt, and no, I'm not alone, etc., etc. All of the angst that I had as a kid, when, as a child, you say to your parents, no, you don't understand. You've never been here. Yeah. And now I'm like, not only did my parents completely understand where I was, there have been 99 million people that have said the same thing. And it makes you less unique, but it makes you fit in so completely. it takes, you think, okay, so now I'm not an individual. You're trying to tell me I'm not an individual. You're so much of an individual connected to a large continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I get a lot of comfort out of that. I also like to spend lots of time in my mind fantasizing on what if, and I like that. It's comforting to me. When I actually see artifacts, I'm fascinated. I'm like, holy, you when you're presented with these pieces of artwork or these buildings or these jewels or any of them, you're like, I think I've got technology. What? Like, they weren't stupid.
No, they weren't. And that's what I keep reminding people. It's like, again, sure, we built on top of older innovations and have the luxuries that we have today, but at the core, nothing has changed. The only real thing that I think that has caused a defining change in history is the invention of the alphabet. If it weren't for that, single invention, I don't know, because remember, it actually took power away from the scribes, from a lot of these elitist, groups and higher levels of classes in the social, hierarchy of whatever nation. It took that power away from them and gave it to the common folk. And once that happened, that changed the whole old world.
The whole
I mean,
world.
the Far East had their own, periods of just reinvention or renaissance or whatever you want to call it. The Americas, they had their own, but in the old world, it was the invention of writing that really was a game changer that changed everything. And honestly, from that point, that's where the only remarkable change, in my opinion, happened. But aside from that, everything has been consistent. Everything has been the same, with the exception of just, technological
and
innovation.
writing uh, energized humanity a few times, because there was the Gutenberg press that did it again, because the writing was, first it was these alphabets that 9,000 characters.
Yeah.
Like, what that? Oh, you mean a picture could mean a picture, or it could actually be a letter? Oh, okay. So which one is it? So you've got these very dense writings, and then they move into pictographs, and then they become Phoenician characters, and then Gutenberg says, "Oh, I can make them available to everyone. Everyone can have a book. Everyone can read the Bible." Well, we were revolutionized yet again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's the story of the apple. That's what the apple is. That is the core of knowledge, making it available to everyone, having the ability for anyone to understand. And once they understand, the world is a completely different place. And
Yep.
there's nothing wrong with being innocent. I'm not saying. And there are a lot of people that are very happy. I've often said, I wish I were one of those people that, you consider stupid. They're just happy. They never complain. They've always got a smile on their face, and they don't think dense things. They just don't. God bless them. They're not stupid. They're not slow. They are that. And, the meek shall inherit the earth. I don't know. But I'm the type of person that thinks on thoughts. So you give me a thought and I'm like, oh, well, what about that? Well, what about that? Well, what about that? And I can repeat, what about that? What about that? What about that? And keep going until I'm off on a tangent. And that's humanity. I'm not saying I'm great. I'm saying that's humanity creating, recreating again and again and again. Like, it's the wheel. What's new with the wheel? Well, the wheel can be gears in a clock. The wheel can be, we can keep on going. The wheel's going to bring us to Mars. We can keep going. So, the wheel, it being what it was, it keeps getting recreated.
Yep.
Beautiful place to end, because I think it's very positive. How can people find you on the internet?
That's a good question because I'm everywhere. So as I've mentioned earlier, I host a podcast called Digging Up the Past, and it's at diggingupthepast.net. That it talks about history and historical related topics. But I have a website. I have a couple websites that I don't really maintain. PetrosKoutoupis.com, which also focuses on a lot of my publications and history related stuff. You have Koutoupis.com, which focuses on all my technology related stuff and technological related publications, which tend to veer towards Linux related stuff. What else? I am quite active with ancient origins. So you will see me, in my articles or, on various recordings on ancient origins. I mean, and if you follow ancient origins on social media, if you get a sarcastic reply, that's usually because of me. So it's not anybody else. It's usually because of me. I tend to have fun with all the social media handles. So if you see somebody having a little fun, definitely, it's me. But what else? I don't know. I can't think of it. The thing is, I've just been anywhere and everywhere all over the internet. But Digging Up the Past / Ancient Origins are my more recent projects.
I will make sure that I correctly cite them below. I thank you very much. I'm very grateful for you coming, and I would love to stay in touch with you and have Ugaritic conversations.
Yes, of course. I'm here for it.
Okay, good. I'm hopeful. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, then. And that's a wrap on this Friday. Thanks, folks.